Reading for I Met You in a Story, 2nd edition, Bob Jones University Press. Night Ride to River Station by Millie Howard. Illustrated by Dell Thompson, Noel Snyder, and John Burke.
In the early days of the 1860s, boys dreamed of being Pony Express riders. This fictional story tells of 10-year-old Seth Thompson. Seth had these same dreams, but he was closer to his dreams than most boys. His family ran a relay station on the Pony Express route. On a spring night in 1861, Seth got his chance for a wild ride he would never forget. Night shadows. Easy now. The bay mare twisted and backed away from Seth. He slipped the reins up and thrust the bit into Copper's mouth. He pulled the reins tight, coaxing the horse toward him. The mare flung her head up. Quickly Seth pulled down hard as he had seen his father do, forcing the mare's head back down. Talking soothingly, he led the dancing mare to the post at the front of the log cabin. When she was safely tied, he gave a sigh of relief. "You need to be ridden more, Copper," he said. "But Pa won't let me ride you express horses." "Not yet, anyway." The express horses were kept separate from the rest of the horses and exercised only by Seth's father. "These horses aren't to learn on," Mr. Thompson had said. "Don't want to teach them bad habits that they might cost a rider his life someday. Learn to ride your pony well. Your time will come soon enough." Seth looked up at the mountains that were casting night shadows on the little valley. Nothing moved on the trail leading down to the cabin. Pete will be here soon." He patted the frigidating horses. "Then you'll get a good workout." Seth knocked the mud off his boots and stepped into the one-room cabin. He sniffed the beans shimmering in a pot hung over the fire. Seth had been smelling them most of the afternoon as he worked outside. Chores seemed to take forever when he was working alone. Now it was late, and his stomach felt like it was tied on a knot from hunger. He walked quietly across the room to the quilt that divided off the sleeping area. "Ma," he said softly. The edge of the quilt lifted, and a small, thin woman stepped around it, holding a barely touched bowl of broth. "The horse is saddled and waiting?" she asked. "Sure, Ma. I tied her to the post outside, just like Pa always does. All Pete will have to do is throw the collar on and ride." He looked at the bowl. "Pa didn't eat." "He's no better." Mrs. Thompson put the bowl on the rough table. "Not so much as a mouthful for 2 days." Seth gave his mother a questioning look. "He's had the fever before." "He'll be all right," she said. "It just takes time. Don't you go fretting now. You have enough to do with to do with that? She smiled at Seth as she ladled beans into a bowl and sat it in front of him. You've been doing a man's work for the last few days. Your pa will be proud of you. Had to be done. Seth turned his head away, embarrassed but pleased in spite of himself. When the milk and crusty homemade bread were sat on the table, Mrs. Thompson sat down across from her son. Seth, why don't you pray tonight? Seth asked the Lord's blessing on the food and then prayed for his father and for the Pony Express rider on his way to their station. When he had finished, Mrs. Thompson looked up. It's not like Pete to be late. Seth nodded as he swallowed a mouthful of beans. Not too late, he answered. About half an hour. He can make that up on the next lap. Copper's raring to go. Copper's always raring to go. Seth grinned. Copper was the youngest of the express mares sent out by the company. She was the youngest and the fastest. Seth's mother always worried about Pete when he rode Copper. But Seth's father said Copper was as sure-footed as a mountain goat and safe enough whenever she knew who was boss. When supper was finished and the table cleared, Pete still hadn't come. Seth went outside, closing the door behind him. The night air was chilly after the warmth of the spring day, and a cool wind blew. The murmuring of the wind and in the fir trees, and watching the clouds drift across the moon. Again and again, his gaze went back to the moonlit trail, leading down to the mountain. But no rider charged from under the trees. The only sound that broke the silence of the night came from Copper as she shifted impatiently, tossing her head. The warm glow of the lamplight spilled across Seth as his mother opened the door. Here, you'll need this. She placed his jacket across his shoulders. Seth thrust his arms into the welcoming warmth. He's late for sure this time, Ma. He'll be along. Don't stay out too long. Mrs. Thompson knew Seth would stay out until Pete came, just like his pa would. She thought as she closed the door behind him. Seth patted the pocket of his jacket. He reached in and pulled out his harmonica. Inside the house, his mother hummed along as Seth played. Suddenly, Seth stopped in the middle of a song. Mrs. Thompson hurried to the door. A rider was galloping wildly down the trail. It's Pete. Seth hurried to the post, unhitching Copper. He led her away from the cabin. They stopped beside the trail leading toward the mountains on the western side of the valley. Copper's ears twitched as the other horse thundered alongside. The rider dismounted a little clumsily. Ho there, Seth. Pete grunted as he threw the mocha over Copper's saddleboard. He stumbled as he reached for the reins and quickly grabbed the saddle to catch himself. "What's wrong?" Seth reached for Pete as he crumbled to the ground. "Ma, Pete's hurt," Seth called. "Bring the lamp." Mrs. Thompson grabbed the lamp and rushed to Pete's side. Seth retied the nervous copper to the post. Mrs. Thompson knelt beside Pete. "He's been shot." "Shot? Who?" "Not now. Let's get him inside," his mother answered. "Help me lift him." The two managed to drag Pete inside the cabin and get him into a bunk. In the other bunk, Mr. Thompson awoke. "What's going on?" He raised himself in one elbow. "Pete's been shot." Seth tugged at Pete's boots. Mrs. Thompson hurried to get hot water and clean clothes. "Who did it?" Mr. Thompson asked. Mrs. Thompson began cleaning the wound. He mumbled something about bandits near the muddy river. She glanced over at her husband. "Now, you lie back and don't worry." Male. Pete tried to lift his head. "Right. The male will just have to wait." Mrs. Thompson pressed him back onto the bed. "No, there's news." Pete struggled to sit up. Fort Sumter's been fired on. "War started. Must get to." "War?" Seth stared at Pete. Mr. Thompson shoved back the blankets and tried to sit up. "No," Mrs. Thompson stopped him. "You're sick. You wouldn't get 2 miles if that far." Mr. Thompson lay back, breathing hard. "Send Seth," he said. "No." Mrs. Thompson pulled the blanket back over her husband. "Ma, I'm a good rider. You know it." Seth began to button his coat. "I know the trail to the river station like the back of my hand." Mrs. Thompson shook her head. "Not at night. Not on an express horse." "Let the boy go." Mr. Thompson's voice was weak but firm. Mrs. Thompson turned away to check Pete's bandage. Seth's father motioned for him to come near. Seth leaned close to hear his father's words. "Seth, remember what you've learned and watch out for the devil's slide." Seth nodded. He wouldn't forget the steep slope on the western side of the mountains. Even an experienced rider could lose a horse going down that bare, gravelly slope too fast. As he turned to leave, his father caught his arm. "Son, be careful." Quickly, Seth hugged his father and brushed past the hanging quilt. He opened the door. "Wait, Seth." His mother ran to the door and hugged him tightly. "The Lord will be with you, son." She let him go. Devil's slide. Seth rushed out the door. Quickly, he adjusted the girth. Untying the reins, he swung into the saddle and galloped up the trail. Seth gripped the mochila with his legs tensely. uneasy at the feel of the leather over the more familiar saddle. Copper felt the movement and swung wide, trying to look behind her. No, you don't. Seth tightened his grip on the reins. Go. Copper flicked her ears and charged on down the trail. For 20 minutes they ran along Moonlit Valley. Then the trail began to shift along the edge of the Black Mountain. Horse and rider left the silvered grass unsped under the dark fir trees. Now only solitary splashes of moonlight patterned the trail. Seth shivered, peering anxiously ahead into the darkness. Copper sensed his uneasiness and broke her stride. Head turned sideways. Seth tightened the reins and jerked hard, too hard. Copper fought back, twisting and turning on the narrow path. A rock slid under her hooves and skittered down the slope. Lord, please don't let me fall and lose the horse, Seth prayed. Help me. He took a deep breath and loosened the reins a little, sitting back in the saddle. Copper slowed and stopped, trembling. For a few moments, Seth talked quietly. When her ears had stopped twitching backwards and she had stopped blowing, Seth urged her forward again. She moved quickly but carefully, still distrustful of her rider. At the top of the ridge, Seth pulled back on the reins. Horse and rider stopped, looking back on the slope to the valley below. Over halfway there. Seth wiped his forehead with his bandana. Too bad the rest isn't the easiest half. He shifted in the saddle to ease his tired muscles. 2 days of hard work and the tension of the last 40 minutes had sapped his energy. Grimly, he faced the western trail. Ahead lay miles of trail through the thinner aspens that lined the ridge. Halfway across the ridge, thickening underbrush had overhanging limbs formed what everyone in the area called Deadman Tunnel. It was 2 miles long and wide enough for only a horse and a rider. At the end of the tunnel were the rocky western slope and Devil's Slide, down into the river valley. 6 miles to go and over an hour behind. Seth loosened the reins. Let's go. Into the aspens they galloped. More moonlight filtered through to the trail here, but the splashes of black and silver confused Seth. Shadows looked like holes in the trail, and silver flashes of the moonlight seemed to leap out in front of the running horse. Easy now. Seth spoke more to himself than the horse. They raced on, shadows darkening as they reached the tunnel. Seth's heart gave a sickening jolt as the dark branches closed over them. Copper's stride lengthened as if she too would like to get out of the tunnel as fast as she could. Seth crouched close to Copper's neck as trees and underbrush crowded the trail, muffling the thuds of Copper hooves on. They raced half a mile. Suddenly, the scream of mountain lions split the darkness. Seth's heart froze. He loosened the reins and yelled. Copper leaped forward, his muscles bunching down the trail and around the bend she ran. Trees flashed past. Alarmed, Seth pulled back on the reins, but the frightened horse only ran faster. He jerked harder, fear growing again. Copper had the bit in her teeth. She was gripping it so hard Seth couldn't turn her head. Branches slashed at them as the horse swung wide around a bend in the trail. Seth pulled on the reins, trying to get the bit from between Copper's teeth. He ducked as an overhanging branch snatched his hat. When he pulled again, the end of the bit came loose. Seth sighed with relief. Only one end left. Steadily, he pulled on the reins, not allowing Copper to get a grip of the loose half. On they raced, Seth gasping for breath. Copper's sides beginning to heave. Around the next bend they swept. Seth's heart leaped. There was a glimmer of cold light ahead. They were nearing the end of the tunnel. Ahead was Devil's Slide. Seth pulled harder, forcing Copper's head back. She shifted the bit in her teeth, trying to get a better grip. Seth felt the bit move and jerked. The bit fell into place, and Copper's headlong pace slackened. Seth gently eased in his grip. They passed the thinning aspens and came out into the open, slowing to steady lope. At the top of Devil's Slide, Seth pulled Copper's to a stop. He ran his hands lightly along her neck and flanks, checking for the telltale foam of a too hard run. It wouldn't do to turn up with a worn-out horse, he thought. Stretching his tired arms, he looked down the slide. Pa says you're as sure-footed as a goat. He spoke quietly to the bay mare. I sure hope so, 'cause tired as we both are, we're going down the slide. Gently urging the horse on, Seth headed down the steep trail. He held his breath as Copper picked her way past the first boulder. As rush gravel slid behind her hooves, but Copper didn't falter. Here on the moonlight slope, she was more sure of herself. She moved slowly and easily past the rocks, sensing her confidence. Seth loosened his grip on the reins and let her pick the way. From time to time, a spattering of gravel below them made him catch his breath, but Copper walked on carefully. At the bottom of the slope, she had stopped and tossed her head. Seth burst into laughter. In response to tension as much as anything else, "You horse," he laughed. "You knew you could do it. It's funny, though. The part I thought would be the hardest was the easiest. That'll teach me to worry ahead of time." Seth patted Copper's shoulder. "Come on. I know you're as tired as I am, but we have some time to make up." Urging Copper into a gallop, he headed toward the broad river. Beside its silver water stood the next relay station. "Ho, station master." Seth galloped into the station yard. Two young men came running with a fresh horse. Seth peeled the mochila from Copper and flung it across the fresh horse. "Hey, you're not Pete." One of the men One of the men grabbed Copper's bridle. "Pete's been shot," Seth answered, "and Fort Summer's been fired on. War's started." The men gave a sharp whistle and called back to the station house. "Ma, Pa, it's Thompson's boy." As the others came running, he turned to Seth. "You've ridden enough tonight. I'll finish the run." Seth nodded wearily. He let himself be led to the station door, and then stopped to watch the rider disappear into the night. "He'll get the mail through." The other man smiled. "You've done a night's work, so to be proud of, Seth Thompson."